deeper understanding the current ecological disruption and crisis is to understand the various dimensions of this crisis in terms of three different phases. The first phase, of course, is the environmental crisis that we see in the massive loss of biodiversity, in the climate chaos, the symptoms of climate chaos that we see taking shape around the world, and so forth. The second phase, the second dimension of the current ecological crisis shows up in terms of a social divide that we see manifest in the symptoms of shocking levels of inequality that amplified in great ways over the past 4 decades, and in the phenomenon that societies that used to hang together begin to fall into pieces, into tribes that fight each other and that lose the capacity to connect with each other across these boundaries. If we look at these two dimensions, the environmental and the social divide, we can say that those two phases or dimensions of the current crisis emerge from a disconnect between self and nature, the environmental crisis, and self and other, the social economic crisis. But then there is a third phase, a third dimension of the current crisis, and that's the spiritual divide, the spiritual crisis we are in. And that arises from a disconnect between self and self, between who I am today and who I could be tomorrow. And if these two aspects of myself are disconnected, what does that look like, feel like? I feel loss of energy. I feel maybe symptoms of burnout, symptoms of anxiety disorder or depression, and in extreme cases, even risk for suicide. All of which are phenomena and symptoms that are greatly amplified over the past years, more or less proportional with the use of social media like Facebook. So if we step back and look at the larger picture, the three divides, the environmental, the social, and the spiritual divide as the three phases of the ecological crisis today, what do we see? We see that collectively, we as a human species create results that nobody wants. We create the environmental divide, the social divide, the spiritual divide. No one stands up in the morning, looks into the mirror and says, and today I'm going to destroy more of our planet, more of our society, kind of our deeper foundations of society, and I will make other people and myself more unhappy. No one is actually doing that. Yet that is exactly what we do on a collective level. We collectively create results that nobody or almost nobody wants. So what have we learned? I think if we have learned anything in dealing with these issues is what does not work, which is if you address these issues one by one. Here in Ministry for Environment, there in Ministry for the social issues, and so on and so forth. That's not working. What we need instead is an approach that looks at the interdependency of all of these three dimensions of the current ecological crisis and applies a systems thinking based approach, by which we mean an approach that's not just reacting against the symptoms, but understanding and addressing the deeper root issues. So what is the essence of such a systems thinking based approach? I have spent the past 2 decades in further developing these approaches to something that today is called awareness-based systems change. And the essence of in many experiments and many practical examples. And the essence of that approach to systems change is this, that you cannot change a system unless you transform consciousness. You cannot change a system unless you transform the mindset of the people who enact that system. Because if you don't, the same people in a new structure will just enact the same problems. And secondly, that to do that, we need new methods and tools that make the system sense and see itself. That's something we know kind of personally, right? If you or I go through a period of transformational change, through a period of behavioral change, we need a coach. We need somebody who is listening to us, who is mirroring back. But that's exactly what we don't have at the level of whole systems. So we need new methods and tools that make, on the level of whole systems, make the system sense and see itself. And to make that happen, we need new infrastructures that facilitate such processes. So in closing, I would say that when you look at the bigger picture, we know we are at the decade of transformation where a lot of transformation needs to happen. Kind of this is the decade that will decide the future. But what we don't have is, so we have that decade, we have that need for transformation, but what we don't have is the capacity to lead these transformations. So we need to build that capacity. That transformation literacy, if you want, and we need to democratize the access to that transformation literacy. And that, I believe, is one of the biggest leverage points today, something that I'm dedicating the remaining years of my life to, and that the Presencing Institute, in collaboration with the United Nations and many other institutions, is trying to bring into reality over the next years.